Yo friends, I want to talk a little bit today about gardening and indigenous peoples. Growing up in my middle school and high school experience, as we had social study courses on Native Americans and other indigenous groups around the world, I was often given the very strong impression or explicitly told that these peoples were hunter-gatherers. And with that terminology came this image of people wandering somewhat aimlessly through wilderness, trying to find dinner. I would have these conceptions of men going out on hunting trips, trying to track down and find and follow wild deer and wild bison. And then I would have these ideas, these images of women wandering around the woods and excitingly calling to one another when they find a blueberry bush in bloom, and they all pick from that blueberry bush because that's the food that they need, and they finally found something for dinner. As I grew up and as I started to learn about these indigenous cultures, as I started to engage with the land on my own, I slowly came to realize that these indigenous peoples all around the world today and thousands of years ago were way smarter than that. They weren't just wandering around aimlessly hoping to stumble across food. They were gardening. When colonizers came to the US, they walked into what they felt like was this wild paradise. Just huge, majestic trees spaced wide enough apart and without any underbrush that they could gallop their horses at full speed through the forests. The colonizers thought this was just like an happenstance, but it definitely wasn't. And as we learn more about those indigenous peoples who lived 500 years ago, we learn about them from their ancestors who are still alive and working the land today. And as we look around the world at other indigenous cultures, we see that these people were gardening just as much and just as intentionally as colonizers, as Westerners, were gardening, just in a very different way. These indigenous peoples were gardening with perennials, trees and shrubs and roots and vines, all that grow year after year after year without needing to be planted. Of course, in North America there were more traditional gardens of corn and beans and squash, but there also were huge acres of gardens full of trees. I'm standing here at a property owned by a friend of mine, previously owned by a different friend of mine, and soon to be sold. So I'm not quite sure what's going to happen to this property in the next few years. But despite it being kind of passed down to a couple different owners, despite this property being completely flooded, like a couple feet underwater, despite this property going through a year or two here and there of little to no care or maintenance, it still flourishes with life because it was intentionally planted and planned to grow perennial trees and shrubs in a way that meets the goals of each of them so that they can flourish with minimal human intervention. These here are some Juneberry bushes, and behind them, this is a row of elderberry. We have some more elderberry planted here, and this is a collection of pawpaw trees. In the back are some big nut trees. They're still young. This is like I think a pecan tree. This is what indigenous peoples were doing. They were planting trees and shrubs that they cared about in places that were easy for them to access. So they weren't aimlessly wandering around the woods. They were going to places where they knew blueberries grew because they planted those blueberry bushes and they knew it was blueberry season. Additionally, there was a lot of care and maintenance in these gardens. It wasn't with a hoe and it wasn't with a till. It was with things like controlled burns. They would do controlled burns of the forest, clearing out the underbrush, making way for more blueberry bushes, and stopping, other things from creeping in the way of the trees and the shrubs that they wanted to be there. Forests that colonizers recognized they could gallop their horses through were intentionally managed and cared for just like the gardens back in Europe. But they were unable to recognize that, or at least not all of them were able to recognize that, and ended up just slashing and burning huge swaths of indigenous gardens to grow more corn, to grow more pasture land for sheep. What I love about this property is that if it's left completely alone from any human intervention over the next few years, it's not going to look pretty. It's going to be pretty hard to walk through. A lot of these trees will have dead limbs that will need to be pruned. But it's still going to be full of life and productive. It's going to be providing lots of food and medicine for animals and for humans who would, forage here, even though they're really walking into what was an old garden. These trees will outlive us. This pecan tree over here will produce pecans way past the time I die. I love this. This gives me such joy and such hope. I spend a lot of time every summer cultivating land to grow tomatoes. It's exciting. I love the taste of tomatoes. I wouldn't stop doing that. But I also want my energies to go towards something longer lasting. I want my energies to go towards growing food for my great grandkids. That is exciting to me. Planting spaces like this and making sure that these spaces are understood and passed down through generations, just like indigenous peoples did. That gives me joy and excitement and hope. I have a bunch of trees and shrubs on my website for sale. A lot of them pre-ordered right now. I'm going to do some shipping in March. I have some some pawpaw trees. I have some elderberries. I have some Juneberries, I think, still. So you can start doing this at home. You can plant even just one of these trees in your front yard or your backyard, and you can grow a bunch of food for your great-grandkids. Thanks for following along, friends. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.